What is consciousness and where does it come from? This is rather open to debate. The neuroscientist and psychiatrist Guilio Tononi is one of the leaders in this elusive field. Here, just before his lecture on the NWG, but we met him right after he flew in from New York. Thank you for being here, Professor Tononi. You work on consciousness for how many years now?
It's embarrassing to say. Let's just say that I decided to work on consciousness one way or the other when I was 16. So
okay.
Some time has lapsed since then. But of course, most of the time I haven't been able to do as much as I would have liked to on consciousness, so you can cut down as many years as you want.
In this cut down years, have you found an easy answer to the question, what is consciousness? A short one?
There is always a short one that I give when I have to give a lecture, and that is, it is what goes away when you fall into dreamless sleep. And the important thing about that is everybody knows what that means. And what goes away seems to be literally everything. You don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you don't feel anything, you don't have any emotion, any thoughts. It's all gone. So as far as you're concerned, there's nothing at all. Then, of course, you come back to consciousness, which can be because you wake up, or it can be because you have a dream. So the shortest way of putting it is consciousness is experience, any experience you might have. Sight and sound, thoughts and feelings, doesn't matter what, any experience. And the opposite is nothing at all.
Okay, so it is everything, and when it's gone, there's nothing.
Yes, as far as you are concerned. You suspect that there will be still thing going on when you're gone. But when you're gone, as far as you're concerned, there's absolutely nothing. Which means consciousness is basically everything as far as you're concerned. So rather big and rather important.
Might be true, yes. But it is subjective. I know I got mine. You could be a zombie and I would never know. So how do you scientific research on something that's subjective?
Well, that it is subjective is indeed one of the essential properties of consciousness. Chalmers is certainly right in saying so, and you know it very well. Your consciousness is yours, and it's not mine. And this leads to this so-called zombie argument, the idea that you cannot even prove for certain so far that your interlocutor, me in this case, is not just a machine, but is seeing things and hearing things and not just acting as if he did. Okay? So yes, the subjectivity is true, and normally scientists think, oh, well, if it is subjective, this is really outside of the realm of science. But quite the opposite, I think. You have to look at what is essential in consciousness, subjectivity being one essential property. And once you list the essential properties, then maybe it is possible to formulate a good hypothesis about what it takes for a physical system of, let's say, the ordinary kind, to be able to support it. So I see subjectivity as something that needs to be explained as opposed to an unsurmountable problem.
What else is there that, what other parts does that puzzle of consciousness need?
Well, the very simple way of putting it is that it has, consciousness, 5 essential properties. And those are in addition to the fact, which is not a property of existing, and that was recognized long ago by Descartes and others. Your consciousness exists, and there is no way you can deny that. It's indubitable, it's immediate, and of course it's inconceivable to think of an experience that you would have that would not exist. So that's a good starting point. Consciousness exists. But what integrated information theory does, IIT is the term I'm going to use for an abbreviation, what IIT does is say that's not all there is to it which is essential, and therefore is a good starting point for a scientific theory. The other 5 are that it is subjective or intrinsic, as we put it. It's yours from your point of view, not somebody else's. That's also immediate. It's also indubitable. And it's also true of every conceivable experience. You cannot think of an experience of yours that would not be yours. Then there are others. One is that it is structured. It always has parts that are related to each other in various ways. You see the left, you see the right, but you see them together into a scene. You hear my voice, you see my lips, you see them together and so on. You see my jacket, you see its color, you see them together. So many, many, many distinctions within each experience bound together in various ways. That's what is the structuredness of consciousness or composition. Information is that every experience is the particular way it is. The one you're having now, which presumably you never had exactly like this before. Well, there is something that makes it what it is and different from unthinkable number of others that are different. And that's a key property. You cannot have an experience that is generic. You're going to have this experience. Okay? These are all seemingly trivial because they are so basic. We don't really pay much attention to them. Finally, two, I'll be very quick. One is the consciousness is unified. This has been remarked by many, including Kant, for instance. The fact that you experience what you experience always as one thing. Yes, you may hear and see things, and they may seem a little bit separated, you know. People talk about modalities, but they are still seen and heard together. There is sort of a center to which they both belong. It's very different to see something and then independently hear something. If you know that you saw and heard the thunder and the lightning, well, that was a joint experience. So it's unified, and always it is. You don't see the left and the right or the visual field separate. It's the field. And the final property that I think is a foundational property of experience is called being definite. It's the so-called axiom of exclusion. Being definite means that your experience contains what it contains, not less and not more. So for instance, right now, your experience contains presumably my face, my voice, some colors, etc. It doesn't contain half of it, say half of my face, or just above my neck, or me without color, and so on and so forth. It doesn't contain more. It doesn't extend behind your back to include the entire room. So again, you can see why it is, in a way, trivial. Of course, it's like that. We are completely used to that. But it is an essential property. It's inconceivable to have an experience that is not definite, meaning it doesn't have borders with what's in and what's out. And of course, there must be a reason, and that's where we get into now science, for experience to have borders. Why does it have borders? Why doesn't it just extend, smear out into the universe? Why those borders? Why does it have to be unified? Why doesn't it break down into various pieces? Why is it that particular way? Why is it structured in that particular way? Why is it subjective? Of course, you can also ask, why does it exist at all? But let's leave that aside. So this is the starting point. This is the explanandum. What needs to be explained is the fact that it exists and these essential properties. Later, we might explain its accidental properties. Why does your face look the particular way it does to me? Okay, the particular tone of color, etc. But those are accidental. Not every experience has to be of that color. And this is true for most other things. Okay. In fact, I insist it's true also for space and time and invariance, meaning the idea of faces. We might be creatures that don't have anything about faces, instead about some other snout or maul, I would say in German, and so on and so forth. And yet it would be an experience. But the fundamental properties always have to be satisfied. That's at least the idea of the theory.
Okay, you already named the theory, integrated information theory. It's got 5 explanandums. And where do they lead you to in this theory?
Yeah, so the explanandum really is conscious. It has 5 fundamental properties that characterize it. And the thing to see is whether with these 5, as opposed to just saying there is consciousness and it's a big mystery where it comes from and how it could possibly come from. IIT then does the second step, which is the most costly step in terms of the time it took, which are the translation of these fundamental properties of phenomenology of consciousness into fundamental properties of its physical substrate. So we essentially postulate, like everybody else, that there is a world out there, a world of physics, which is there independent of me, and it can be manipulated and observed. The criterion for the physical, if we go a very long time back, in fact was formulated at the time of Plato more or less, and I still think is the best, has to do with being able to take a difference and make a difference. If I can do this to your questions, I actually manipulate something, and I observe the changes, and I can easily say, well, there's got something there, you know. He has some pieces of paper where he has written some questions. And that is the simple-minded test for the physical in everyday life. But you can go beyond everyday life into the most sophisticated science and the search for the Higgs boson, and the very same criteria apply, just indirectly. You are not going to convince somebody of the existence of Higgs bosons if you cannot show observable effects of some sort, and if you cannot manipulate an accelerator to produce the right energy level, and so on and so forth. So it's much more indirect. But it's still, we're convinced that something exists physically if it can, I put it, take a difference, you can do something to it, and make a difference. It can do something to you, as small as that might be. So that's the criterion for the physical in general. And so IIT wants to translate the essential property of consciousness, those 5, into essential properties that any physical substrate must satisfy if it can be a substrate for consciousness. And it turns out that that is actually extremely constraining. It's not that everything will do, okay? You have to actually have physical system with very, very specific properties to be able to account for consciousness. Although it can be greater, it can be little consciousness, high consciousness. So the work has been this translation into what are now called postulates, which are the same. They have to do with intrinsicality, composition, or being structured, being specific, being unified, and being definite, which we can express in physical terms, so operations, observations. And they get given a mathematical form, so that in principle we can literally go and look at different physical systems and say, well, how well is the system doing with respect to these 5 properties? In other words, can it in principle be a substrate for consciousness? Consciousness is primary. You start from your own consciousness, and we make up a story about the existence of a physical world. It's a very good story, and there is very good evidence for it, while the evidence for your consciousness is absolute, indubitable. The evidence for the way the physical world is good, but not absolute. You start from there, you start from consciousness. This is the starting point also of science. There would be no science without conscious beings, okay? But then, of course, there is plenty of good evidence about a particular model of the world in terms of things that take and make a difference and how they interact, that explain lots of things, has given us a lot of power, but at the same time now we have the hard problem of fitting our own view of our own existence as conscious being, that's the only existence that matters,
yes.
Okay, within the successful framework, scientific framework of the physical world, where we see that there are things like brains that seem to be especially important. But that wasn't so clear a long time ago. It's become clear only over the past, let's say, 500 years has been really clear. And now we are still very primitive in terms of where within the brain, because it looks like it's not the entire brain. Some parts of the brain we can take out, and you may have problems, but not in your consciousness. Okay. And other parts of the brain are more controversial. Does it really matter for consciousness or not? And here we are still very much in a primitive state of affairs. IIT, in principle, would allow you to take anything, whether it's a brain or a liver or a computer, it doesn't matter, that is physically constituted, is a physical substrate, potentially apply these measures that translate the axioms of IIT, the essential properties of phenomenal kind, into essential properties translated into the physical, and see, well, is it there, is it not there, how much, and of which kind. Also, the quality of consciousness is critical. Why does it feel like this? Say space and color and time and so on, and not some other way. That also has to be explained by a theory of consciousness. Now, I said in principle because in practice it's incredibly hard, meaning then calculations are immense, so we need to make many approximations and then the actual tools to get at the right level, because you could do this at the level of neurons, for instance, in the brain, but also at the level of molecules or atoms, or you could go to the level of macro units, like groups of neurons, at different timescales. And all these levels will tell you something about the physical interaction within that system. But according to IT, there is the right level, and that has to be found on first principles. So it's practically very complicated to do it right. I can't just take an instrument and just measure your consciousness like that. I wish I could. What we can do is informed guesses and very crude approximations that we have started already applying in the clinic.
So you work with patients? This is one group you try to measure?
Yes, we work with ourselves primarily, so a lot of work with healthy subjects. Then we work with patients or with manipulations of consciousness like anesthesia, in which we can produce at least big changes in consciousness. What sort of everybody more or less agrees is happening is I was conscious, then the doctor gave me this propofol injection and I was gone. Consciousness was gone. So this is big, and we must see a big difference in some of these measures that we think index consciousness. Sleep is another good case in point. Early in sleep, you sort of vanish. And then later you tend to come back in the form of a dream. So we have interesting changes between being conscious, not really being conscious again, although you are disconnected from the environment. And so under these conditions, since this is us, and we are still, the best place where to try and validate the theory, there we have tried to do many experiments to see whether some measures of integrated information do actually behave as predicted. They should be high when you're conscious, and they should collapse when you lose consciousness, okay, in these very basic cases. And this so far has succeeded really well. In fact, it probably succeeded better than anything we have right now. The very first study was done on ourselves, literally, and then other healthy subjects, using transcranial magnetic stimulation and high-density EEG. This is just a tool, but we had to develop the tool to be able to sort of knock on the brain and see how it will respond. The idea being that if it responds in a complex manner, and yet there's one integrated system, this sort of fulfills some of the basic requirements of integrated information theory. It's both unified and informative, differentiated. It's very crude, but at least it gives you an indication, and it's causal because you are perturbing the brain. So we did that, and if I do this in you when you're awake, and then when you are in early non-REM sleep during the night, in which your brain is still active almost just as much, but somehow you lose consciousness, we found that the response became much less complex, so much less compatible with low phi, which is sort of the measure of integrated information that we use when you lose consciousness. So that fit the prediction. Then we did it with many subjects. Then we started doing anesthesia of different kinds. Then we did dreaming, which is, on the surface you are just asleep as before when you had no consciousness, but now sometimes you do regain consciousness. In fact, it can be a very beautiful and strange dream where you have experiences, so by definition you're conscious, not of the environment, but you're conscious. And there the measure was supposed to go back up, and it did regularly. So that's an interesting task because the state of the subject is not really changing. I mean, he's still asleep, in the same state of sleep. Sometimes he dreams, sometimes he doesn't. So it was a good test. The measure should be high and low, not depending on the overall state of the brain, but whether you're conscious or not, and it did. So with anesthetics, same story. When you lost consciousness, quite obviously the measure went down. But with one anesthetic in particular, which is ketamine, that is rarely used alone, but still sometimes in children and certainly in large animals, where we did it on healthy volunteers, they lose responsiveness, meaning they are anesthetized and you could do surgery on them. But when they come out, unlike the other anesthetics, they regularly report at the appropriate doses incredibly vivid and long dreams, having nothing to do with the hospital where they were treated. Okay. And so this is well known, and we confirmed this by asking them right afterwards. And this index jumped back up like it does when you dream or when you are conscious during the day. So there are some counterintuitive aspects. Okay, if you base it on behavior, if you base it on responsiveness, you would draw the opposite conclusion. You need something that evaluates the state of the brain with respect to consciousness according to a theory, not just according to, well, it's not moving, therefore. Okay. And then the rest was really applied to patients who are more difficult to understand. So we had a very good validation in us. And with these different manipulations, we were able to show that the value of this index, which is called perturbational complexity index, and was developed by a colleague of mine in Milan, was really above this value, you are conscious, below this value, you are not. And then we can use that to go to the bedside of patients with a vegetative state, which is now called, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome sometimes, or with so-called minimally conscious state, where it's difficult, but some good neurologists can say, I suspect there is somebody home, so to speak. And essentially the index did very well. So it clearly says that the minimally conscious patients identified by good neurologists are high in this quantity. So high consciousness, sort of like you and me from what we can tell, even if it is crude. And instead the vegetative patients typically no, but even there, there was a surprise, so to speak. You have like 3 levels. 0, and then essentially we believe there is no functioning nervous system that can support consciousness of any sort. Values which are the ones you normally find in a deeply sleeping healthy subject or under anesthesia. So they are low, they are not appropriate for consciousness, but they suggest something is going on that maybe with some interventions you may make them jump over the threshold, like waking somebody up, literally. Okay. And then a fraction around 20–25% with values like you and me. And they don't respond at all. So from the outside you couldn't tell. From the MRI, you don't know really what's going on. It's very unclear from the MRI how things are. And from this index, it really suggests that there is somebody there, and we should try to establish communication, maybe through brain-machine interface.
Adrian Owen playing tennis, something like that.
Yeah, the playing tennis paradigm of Adrian Owen was really the first sort of elegant demonstration using fMRI that in some of these seemingly vegetative patients, you could establish communication, but instead of having them say yes or no, they would conjure in their mind a scene, for instance, playing tennis or going through the room, that lead to very clear signature, usually in normal subjects. And those signatures were seen also in that patient. She had roughly the same thing. So because it was a response to command, it was just, locked in. It was made explicit only in terms of brain activity patterns. That was a case that it would be very hard, although some people tried, to refute the conclusion that she's there. She's just not able or willing to move, but she can do that in her mind. Okay, these cases are few and far between. It's very hard because you may be conscious and incapable, even though people who are conscious sometimes can't do that because you need to sustain attention for a while. Instead, the PCI index would certainly identify such cases, but it doesn't require any effort on the part of the patients. We're just probing the brain sort of like an electrician. We are inserting a pulse of current, we see the reverberation of the current, and depending on that we say there is consciousness there.
Okay.
So it can work in a much larger proportion of patients. They may be confused, they may be tired, they may be incapable of sustaining attention, then they would fail the playing tennis test, but they wouldn't fail the TMSEG.
Last time I talked to your colleague Christoph Koch, he came up, and I was wondering about that, with quantum physics again. I thought this was an explanation back from the 70s, but it seems to be coming back. Do you think there is some quantum physics aspect in consciousness? Or do we just explain the unexplainable via something else unexplainable?
Well, there are inevitable some quantum physics aspect in consciousness because of the way our brain is constituted, and there is an interesting twist now in science over the past few years, which suggests that there may be some quantum level phenomenon happening at the temperature of the brain, which is was hard to believe before, but there may be some events. But the fact there may be some events of some meaning, even at sort of room temperature or body temperature, doesn't mean that they play an important role. Okay, there is a lot of quantum level activity happening in our liver, and yet doesn't seem to be very important for consciousness. Okay, so we have to keep something in mind. I mean, for consciousness, unfortunately, what happens is that because it has been christened as the hard problem, and essentially most people assume that it will never be solved, it cannot be solved, it goes beyond the realm of science, or you name it. Or in the best case scenario, you just wait for science to run its course, amass more and more data, and then perhaps one day we understand, okay? Yes, there is sort of freedom to come up with any notion, and you can explain the unexplainable by the unexplained, and so on and so forth, do all of those things, which are essentially, I think, a syndrome of a failure of imagination. So we don't really think it's doable. Consciousness looks like a transparent, impenetrable wall, and you don't see any attack point, and then there are very understandable psychological reactions, like you deny there is a wall, you turn your back and go in the other direction, or you say the wall is a quantum wall, or who knows what else, in order to essentially justify your inability to even think how the problem could be grasped and attacked. Okay? Like a climber who sees absolutely no place to put her hands, okay? You invent some excuse of some sort. Instead, otherwise I wouldn't be working on integrated information theory. I believe that you have to take this perspective from the inside. That is, you have to say what is true of my consciousness, what are its essential properties, translate them into physical terms, and once you do it, which is not an easy process but can be done, you can actually test the predictions of the theory. For instance, you can check whether this particular piece of biological organization, let's say the brain, and this particular part of the brain, and within that, this particular part, does it have the wherewithal to support this very high value of phi, which is presumably needed for us, okay? And does it do in a way that accounts for the particular way our experience feels? Like, for instance, it feels spatial, it feels temporally extended, it feels colored, or all the other phenomenal properties. So this is a doable exercise. In fact, we are doing it. We are beginning to do it. It requires lots of computational resources, but it's absolutely not something that you need to invoke mysterious new things to do. You just need to understand better what it takes for something to exist from its own perspective in a structured, specific, unified, and definite manner. And then you'll be surprised. So, in fact, the reason I'm optimistic is because even if our tools are crude, and our understanding is still, of course, very limited, the theory can predict what could be and what could not be a substrate of high consciousness. And for instance, about our own brain, it can predict rather clearly and then explain why, say, the cortex in general seems to be in a very good position to have high consciousness. By other part of the brain, a standard example is the cerebellum, which is back here, and it has 5 times more neurons than the cortex. But it's also connected to inputs of all sorts, it has maps, and it's connected to cortex a lot. So why does that piece of brain not contribute at all to what you experience? Well, it contributes to regulating your gait and so on and so forth. You can cut it all out, and nothing happens to your consciousness, essentially. We have several cases of this. So that's it's a challenge. It says, well, it's as brain-like as you want, as complicated as you want, if there is something important being complicated, which is not clear. And it's connected intensely to cortex. So why would my consciousness, so to speak, end in cortex and not extend into this fantastic tool of neurons? That's the cerebellum. But it doesn't. So you need to explain that. I think we explain that quite properly. And I think one of the most intriguing parts that we are working on right now is even within cortex, there is evidence that some parts are important for consciousness, some parts aren't. Now, there's also great ignorance and great controversy, so people, let's say, are not so sure about which parts. In fact, some people may think that all of cortex somehow must matter, okay, just because it's simple. But I think the experimental evidence, if you look at it objectively, is pointing definitely in certain directions. But be it as it may, IIT has an interesting position there. IIT says whatever the subset of consciousness is, it must satisfy these 5 essential properties in physical terms. So the short version is it must be a global maximum of intrinsic cause-effect power. That's just another way to say all these properties, intrinsicality, being structural, being specific, being unified, and being definite, they must be satisfied by this physical substrate once you know how to do it, to check what it does. And so we should look for that in our cerebral cortex. My guess is we are going to find that there is a maximum, and this maximum is not going to be the entire cortex. And it's not going to be probably most of the prefrontal cortex, for instance, which people take as sort of the most evolved and sophisticated of all our organs in the brain. It's going to be primarily in posterior regions, in the back of the cortex, where the sensory input comes in and the body input comes in, visual, audition, etc., which is organized in a way much more simply. It's like grids stacked upon grids with little hierarchies and so on and so forth. That part, we think, has the prerequisites to be really hi-fi and to be a maximum. So now the theory essentially is making a very strong prediction. It says, if we find a maximum with all due restrictions in terms of the methodological tools we have of cause-effect power, which is what the theory says, independent of what it is made of. Is it neurons? Is it transistors? Is it groups of neurons? It doesn't matter. Wherever there is a maximum of that, there should be consciousness. And this can be tested first and foremost in us. If that maximum turns out to be in the same areas of the brain, say cortex, where the empirical evidence suggests that if I kill those, you lose consciousness. If I take one of those, you lose a piece of consciousness, so to speak, the ability to see faces and so on and so forth. If that fits, it's good for the theory. If it turns out that you do something to this maximum of phi, and nothing really happens to consciousness, but you do it somewhere else and something big happens to consciousness, the theory is dead. Okay? So this is an area which is delicate in the sense of, the tools are never ideal. fMRI has temporal resolution, which is not ideal. Spatial resolution is okay, but not that great yet, and so on. But still, it can give us a sense. So I think the predictive and testing the prediction side of the theory is becoming much, much more precise, and for that reason, intriguing.
It sounds wonderfully down to earth. And it sounds like you might solve a problem that we are about to face, which is when do computers become conscious? So you will be able to measure it via phi.
Yes, and I'm actually very passionate about this. I consider this to be an urgent matter. And this is because you can show in IIT, and we have shown, the main paper is coming out soon, that no matter how sophisticated one of our computers is right now, the one that are able to drive cars, the one that are able to have a conversation, the ones that are able to translate a conversation and solve mathematical problems and all kind of other problems. They are not yet as good as we are in everything, but they're getting better and better and better. Mm. But if their physical substrate is that of a computer, which it is, IIT says that they have literally zero consciousness. They will be able, in principle, to do all the things we do, talk as intelligently or unintelligently as you and I do, convince you that you won't have dinner with me now, because, yes, this is quite interesting, and yet there will be absolutely nobody there. And IIT is unique in this. It doesn't say computers are not because they are cold, they are machine, they don't have emotion. No. Computers can simulate anything. They're not there yet, but they will. Mm. And when they do that, we will not be able to tell them apart from other human beings, except for perhaps for saying they're nicer, they behave better, they are vastly educated, and so on and so forth. But if IIT is right, there is really a complete divide there. They would be functionally equivalent to us, from a point of view of what you can do with them, they are like us. They would be phenomenally, absolutely different from us. They won't exist at all. And this has obviously very, very big ethical implications, as you can imagine.
Yes.
Whether we as a society in the end values doing, what you get things that do things very well, or values being ultimately, that you exist and you exist in that particular thing. IHE makes that divide extremely sharp.
It's a pity we have to finish here because the bar is about to open. Thank you very much.
Thank you.